Welcome back. In this mini lecture, I would like to make a brief introduction into ESP tests. By the end of the lecture, you are expected to be able to differentiate between ESP tests and other general English language proficiency tests. You will also have the opportunity to get to know about 3 key aspects that ESP test designers need to consider in their course of test design. We are going to start this lecture by watching a short video about ESP test produced by British Council. While viewing this video, could you please take notes of how ESP tests differ from other English language proficiency tests and some typical examples of ESP tests.
We usually think about English language as being either focused on everyday communication or for communication in specific situations, like business or medicine. This second type of language is called English for Specific Purposes, or ESP for short. Now, you might think that ESP tests are just tests of general proficiency with some technical vocabulary thrown in. But actually, they really are quite different. First of all, when ESP tests are developed, they're based on something called a needs analysis. Before we start to design such a test, we first identify exactly what someone working in the specific context actually does in their job. Sometimes this can be done through questionnaires, but probably the best way to go about it is to observe real working situations. It's easy to tick boxes in a questionnaire to say what you think you do, but in fact, you may not realize all the other things you do as well. Things that an impartial outside observer will notice. The international nature of the workplace means that there has to be a common language of communication, and nowadays that language is English. So, for example, the pilot of a Japanese plane approaching an airport in Peru will communicate with the local air traffic controllers in English. This situation has led to the development of specific purpose tests for air traffic controllers. As you might expect, exactly the same is true for workers in other professions. Perhaps the first specific purpose tests for non-native speakers of English were developed for business. Test designers identified the types of tasks that English native speaker business employees were commonly required to perform in their everyday work life. For example, an employee might have to take notes at a meeting in order to write a report, or to communicate with clients or colleagues over the phone, maybe even reporting back to other colleagues. Test tasks were then designed to reflect these authentic workplace contexts. When test takers later performed these tasks in an ESP test, we were able to predict how they might perform similar tasks in their job. Of course, it's not possible to cover every type of task in all business contexts, so we can only include a sample of tasks in any single test. But then, this is true of all tests. Other workplace contexts where ESP tests are commonly used include law and medicine. As you can imagine, in the different work contexts, the actual tasks will be quite different, while employees will probably need different language profiles. By this we mean they may be expected to have different levels of ability in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. A special type of ESP test is called an EAP, or English for Academic Purposes test. This is the type of test you'll need to take if you're applying to attend a university where the language of study is English. Right now, IELTS is the best-known international EAP test. It was originally designed by the British Council to assess the ability of candidates to study in English. Of course, there are other such tests around, large-scale international tests such as the TOEFL and smaller-scale tests developed by individual universities for their foundation or pre-sessional students. In the same way that different jobs will require different ability profiles, we find the same in EAP. It's not unusual for different faculties or schools to ask for very different profiles, since some skills will be considered more important than others for different subjects. As you can see, ESP and EAP tests are designed to reflect real-life situations, either in work or in study. These types of tests are precise in that they accurately reflect a specific language use area. This means that the test tasks, the scoring system, and the final test report can all be related to the specific work or study area in focus. If this link isn't obvious, then it's likely that you're not looking at an ESP test at all. As the worlds of work and study change, the need for a deeper understanding of the role of language in these areas increases. So we can be pretty sure that assessing English for specific purposes will continue to play an important role in ensuring that individuals are ready to participate fully in these worlds.
As you have seen from the video above, ESP tests are different from other English language proficiency tests in several ways. In what follows, we shall look at 3 key aspects that ESP test designers need to examine in their process of test design. The first one is the question of test content and of its specificity or otherwise. The second is the issue of test method, of how the assessment might be carried out. A further issue is that of test validation. How are we to know that the tests we have produced are valid? I shall take these in reverse order. Test validation requires that we can produce evidence to show that our test measures what we claim it measures and nothing else. In the case of a bank cashier, we need to be able to show that our test does actually measure a cashier's ability to perform adequately in that designed target situation. This means either that we need some way of observing bank cashier in action and of judging the adequacy of their performance, so that we can then compare our test results with the performance, or that we need some way of knowing from an analysis of our observation what it takes to perform adequately as a bank cashier. I believe that at present we do not have such ways of knowing or observing, and therefore we have no way of knowing whether our tests are valid from a content, construct, or face validity point of view. The likely implication of this for test design is that our ESP test might have to be performance-oriented, that is, they won't have to be attempts to test language use, and they won't have to be direct, rather than indirect, tests of such use. A direct test of writing ability, for example, would be some writing task, whose product was subjectively judged by assessors. An indirect test might be a multiple-choice test of paragraph organization, or an error detection task. This brings us to the second issue, that is, of test method. It is likely that ESP tests will, insofar as they are tests of use and of language production, have to involve some element of subjective judgment of performance. Of course, this presents the problem of the training of examiners and a likely reduction in reliability. But this is in line with recent developments in language testing. In fact, in order to take full advantage of their innovatory potential, ESP tests must take account of the most recent developments in language testing. These developments include a reduced emphasis on the importance or at least primacy of statistics and statistical evidence for validity, and along with this an increased concern for test content, test methods, and the opinion of outsiders in test development or face validity. They also include a greater closeness between testing and teaching, such that we are beginning to recognize that there is little difference in design between a test and an exercise. This means that the typology of exercises that have been developed for use in teaching material are entirely relevant for the development of test techniques. Indeed, test developers are increasingly looking to the most innovative textbooks for ideas on test method. And it may be that in the future, textbook writers might look to tests in a positive way for examples of possible exercises and tasks. Language testing is beginning to show an increased use not only of authentic or realistic text, but also, crucially, of authentic purposes for language use. In other words, the tasks that test takers have to carry out on tests increasingly reflect the sorts of thing they might have to do with language in the real world. Hence, the increased interest in performance testing results in an acceptance of the new inevitability of subjective judgments and of the need for training to ensure the test reliability. It has also led to an increased suspicion and even abandonment of multiple choice tests and the development instead of formats requiring short answers, so-called short answer questions, which might be more realistic, less tricky, and potentially more valid. All these developments in language testing methods need to be taken account into the developments of what influential ESP tests. The content of language tests, too, is of crucial importance. It was suggested above, when referring to examples of plausible ESP tests of bank cashier or overseas doctors, that an analysis of the target situation and the communicative demands such situation place upon participants might help us to determine the content of the test. To oversimplify, all the test designer apparently has to do is to produce a needs analysis of the specific target situation in order to identify the test content. Indeed, the identification of communicative needs is at the center of ESP test design.